everyone, and welcome back to 48 Now. I'm digital host AJ Wiest, and today I am joined with the familiar face, Dr. Waymon E. Burke, former poli-sci and history professor. Dr. Burke, we have a new president since we last spoke. What are your thoughts on just like the past few months, like the transition of power and President Trump's first week in office?
Well, I've heard it said early on after his election that we need to buckle our seatbelt, and I would say the first week in office actually has underscored that. We have to tighten that seatbelt. He's come out very aggressive, some things very controversial, and many, including academic scholars and law scholars and so forth, many of them say that what he's proposing, like the citizenship, birthright citizenship, is blatantly unconstitutional. I mean, I'm just a simple high school and later college instructor of political science and so forth, but I do know what the 14th Amendment says, and it's pretty direct. But then there's always a lot of show, and I'm not just pinning that on President Trump, because all politicians sometimes use false flags, you might say, to enhance their power. And even those who disagree with birthright citizenship, if he ultimately loses in the courts, he'll say, "Well, I went to the wall for you. I tried." Right. And in politics, strangely, that works. So Alabama is no stranger to a lot of lawsuits like that, challenging Supreme Court decisions.
Absolutely. And also, would you talk about some of his cabinet appointments thus far? Several have been confirmed. Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense.
I think Rubio is one of those people, even people who may disagree with him, he was confirmed unanimously, as he should have been, because I've somewhat followed his career, and he's a competent person. And there are many people that we've got to understand that even if we may disagree with them on policy issues, are smart people, and they're not deranged, let's say. And he would be one of those people.
Right. And then there's other deemed controversial picks, RFK Jr., which his confirmation hearing is later on today. And did any kind of shock you or stand out?
Well, yeah, some of them did shock me, and I'll get back to RFK, but this woman that he has designated to be Secretary of Education is a professional wrestling promoter. Puzzles me. But the RFK Jr., of course, very controversial person, especially on vaccines. On Tuesday night, his cousin, Caroline Kennedy, daughter, of course, assassinated President JFK, came out very forcibly against him, telling us some things about him that, for example, not only the cruelty to animals, about putting small animals in a blender while they're living and mixing them up to feed his hogs and so forth, but that while he is critical of vaccinations, which many people have followed, supposedly, he had his own children vaccinated. And so, that gives us pause, if you will, or it does me. You want to hear this story. I actually was around him. I met him 45 years ago when I was a little bit younger. And back in those days, this would be in about 1980 is when it was, and it's when his uncle, Ted Kennedy, was running for president, challenging in the Democratic primary President Jimmy Carter. And he was in Alabama campaigning for those Alabama delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Now, in those days, the Democrats were the very dominant political party in Alabama. It's not the way it's become over the past few years. And so almost everybody was, the Democratic nomination, for example, for an office in most situations meant that it was a shoo-in. The reverse seems to be true today. And so Bobby Kennedy, as a younger man, was here campaigning for his uncle. And I met him, I was in his presence, let's say, after meeting him at least 2 times that I remember very well. To tell you the truth, I didn't care for him. I felt he was aloof, very arrogant man. Now, that's no reason that, he shouldn't be appointed to something. But, and I don't talk about just for me, I'm just talking about everybody there. Mm-hmm. He was just very aloof and very arrogant. I know that we were at a political event that they call a Democrat hoedown over at the Elks Club building, and a facility that Democrats and Republicans have used over the years to have party meetings and so forth. And I was at a table that he was sitting at, and my wife and I were there, and half a dozen people. And at some point it shrunk down to 3 or 4 people, and one of them was this very intelligent woman who still lives here that I've always had great respect for, was just trying to talk to him the way you and I are. Mm-hmm. And he just pulled up a newspaper right in the middle of the conversation and started reading it. I remember that, and I thought at the time how rude and mm-hmm. arrogant that was. But that's a little just personal observation of him. I'm sure he's a smart guy. He wrote a very important book on Judge Frank Johnson, who was very important in the Alabama desegregation cases and so forth in the 60s and 70s. But a lot of people here just were not impressed with him. I think they just felt he was better than we were. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican, most people don't really like that.
That's right. Don't bother me, I'm reading. But Dr. Burke, talk about DOGE, a new Department of Government Efficiency, and also Elon Musk. What exactly is this new department, and why Elon to lead it?
Well, as I understand it, it's not going to be an official, but an unofficial, I guess, Andy Jackson back in the 1820s and 1830s called them kitchen cabinets. Right. He had his advisors who were not formally part of government but influenced him, and every president has those folks. But of course, Elon Musk is a whole different stripe. He's the wealthiest man in the world that we're told, and probably builds the ugliest pickup ever built in the history of pickup trucks for those of us like me who like pickup trucks.
Right.
But he and who was the other guy?
Ramaswamy?
Yeah, Ramaswamy. Yeah. They're going to head this thing. But of course, Elon pumped, some people say, and don't hold me to these numbers, but mega millions maybe, into the Trump campaign. And I heard a jokester the other day said, he has the receipt.
That's right.
So he's supposedly going to head this thing. But one of the problems I've always found about Alabama politics specifically, and politics in general, is when people call themselves conservatives and liberals, with liberals being supposedly stereotyped as want to spend more money, and conservatives wanting to spend less money and have smaller government. Well, it may be according to what you want to spend the money on. Yeah. A lot of people are very, when they find out they're going to cut what benefit I'm getting, I'm not talking about me personally, well, I'm not for that, although I'm a conservative, but don't cut my money, that right. type of thing. So Alabama has always been one of what critics call the taker states. It's about 9 or 10 supposedly taker states that get more money back from the federal government than we as a citizen actually pay into the federal government. Because the other 40 states, many of them are getting less money back. At one time, for example, New Jersey got back like 75 cents for every $1 their citizens collectively paid in. So we sort of use the Robin Hood approach here, and I think we sometimes forget that. We want to complain about big government, but Huntsville was built on big government, and I'm not saying that critical. I've often said every time I see the head of a defense contractor, I want to hug their neck, because I know, although I don't work for them, I know what raises our boats is the money spent in this community. Let's take specifically Medicaid, as opposed to, say, Medicare and Social Security. And Medicare and Social Security, we pay into that. You're already paying. As a young man, I hated it back when I was your age. I love it today.
That's right.
Since I'm a recipient of both.
Right.
But Medicaid is probably the bulk of the people who get Medicaid are not people who actually paid into it. It's for the poor. And I would say that the vast majority of them are children and old people who don't have anything.
Right.
The thing is, there's so many older people out there who didn't have pension plans, and Social Security is not enough to cover their living expenses, and because they lived a very poor life, that is, with concerning income, or maybe even mismanaged it, whatever. Many of those people in nursing homes and so forth it's from Medicaid. And if that money is drastically cut, does that mean that an elderly aunt or uncle or parent must be moved into your back bedroom, and they're incontinent, by the way, and somebody's got to stay home and watch them because if they have Alzheimer's, they may burn down the house, that type of thing. And I think there are a lot of situations to where even if we're critical of government spending, that we may not actually be aware of the consequences of what that may mean. And are we as conservative, and that's a very loose definition of a word, as we say we are? Surveys have been taken that so Alabamians, if you just ask them, am I liberal or conservative, the overwhelming majority say, well, I'm a conservative. But if you start asking them about specific issues that affect your lives that involve, in this case, federal and state spending, they're for those things.
Right.
And so that's one of the great contradictions about our culture. And Alabama's not the only state that is guilty of this. I think it's human nature for us to be. But I think we sometimes forget those things. And another thing about liberal and conservative, I think many people view the term in religious connotation, and that gives, I think, a misreading of what the terms actually mean as well. But perhaps we can talk about that in another show.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. But you mentioned how reliant we are on the federal government.
We
here
are very
in Huntsville.
reliant. We are Federalville.
Right.
They should change the name to Federalville.
Yes, sir. Just how much, like, the federal grant freeze, how impacted will the Huntsville community be by that?
I think everybody's trying to figure that out. I've been reading like you have online and listening to the good guys at Channel 48 here talk about it. I was listening to it right before I came in. They were interviewing Bill Kling, and
right.
prominent city councilman here, of course, and I don't think people actually know for sure how that could negatively impact us. And it may impact things that many of us probably don't have a direct connection to, like Meals on Wheels. I've never worried really about a meal, but I know there are people who do. Mm-hmm. How does it affect some child care things, so that poor families can afford to actually go out and work and know that their children are safe with a caretaker? Because in many cases, if they lose those benefits, then they can't work, and that creates other problems, of course. Right. Talking about buying out federal workers, if you're talking about doing away with those jobs, theoretically, there are, I'm told, like 40,000, give or take, people who drive through those Arsenal gates every day. If those jobs disappeared, it would have and they're not replaced, that has a tremendous negative impact on the Huntsville economy. I could say if we lost even a portion of those jobs, what happens to the value of your house, for example, which is most people's biggest investment? It's that would be economically disturbing to government communities like Huntsville.
Obviously, Dr. Burke, me and you, we can't see into the future.
No.
But what do you think, like, it might look like in 2028?
Well, in 2028, of course, President Trump is term limited, so we'll see what his popularity ratings are. His popularity ratings are not great, although he won, and no question about that he won. When I hear people use terms like mandate and that type of thing, well, it really doesn't describe the history of the way we use mandates, but I understand hyperbole in politics and but he controls the levers of government, has narrow majorities in both houses of Congress. If these actions prove to be very negative, over the next 2 years, we have congressional elections. What happens in the Senate and the House? And so it could be a bumpy ride. I mean, it could create great chaos, and which I would argue is in no one's interest. And I don't think any president, whether it's any president's ever held office, including Donald Trump, would really want to destroy the economy.
No.
But sometimes actions we take could threaten that. Mm-hmm. And I think that worries a lot of people, the uncertainty.
Absolutely. Talk about former President Joe Biden, like his legacy as president and as a person. How do you think he'll be remembered?
I would argue it's like Jimmy Carter. Let's talk about Jimmy Carter first, because that's a good lead-in.
Absolutely.
Jimmy Carter was a Southerner, of course, and the first Southerner elected president in almost a century at that time. And he was, had the big grin and so forth, and he, as governor, he actually challenged racism and so forth, and there was much hope. But inflation rose to almost 20%, as did interest rates, which devastated the economy. And for those of you who are old enough to remember this, you know what I'm talking about. You can't buy a house at 20% interest. And that meant building just died. Mm-hmm. And when building died, so did work for carpet layers, bricklayers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians. I mean, it created massive unemployment to go with it. Economists invented another term called stagflation, where inflation and unemployment and interest rates were all, just very high. And I remember being at an event where a U.S. senator from Alabama at the time, his name was Stewart, Don Stewart, I believe was his name. He was only senator for 2 years. And he lost his bid for a full term in, I think it was 1980. And I was at an event where he was at a news conference. And there were some people standing around. There were some men with sawed-off 2x4s. They were about maybe 18 inches long or so forth. Just sawed up 2x4s, maybe a dozen of them or so. And when they were through, and they did this very peacefully and so forth, it turned out they were laborers, they were carpenters and so forth. And they went and they laid the 2x4s down in front of him and said, "We're unemployed because of the economy." He was getting the blame for it as well. Mm-hmm. When you don't have money coming in, that's a very traumatic experience for any family. And that was their way of protesting. And I've forgotten the answer that Senator Stewart gave. It was probably a pretty good answer, but it didn't give them a job, so to speak. What the Fed was trying to do at this time, and the painful medicine, simply put, of killing inflation, is to slow down the flow of money through the economy. And one way that you do that is to raise interest rates so people spend less money. That's the whole concept behind it. And inflation will usually fall as a result of that, but it takes time. So and then he had the hostage crisis in Iran in 1980. And it looked like for a while he might pull it out, but in the end he did not. And also a very interesting thing, many of the what is sometimes called the evangelical wing of Christians and so forth turned against him. They had been with him, helped put him in office in favor of Ronald Reagan. and and so that was an interesting shift as well. So he lost as a result of that. He like Harry Truman before him. Harry Truman had so low, but by the time you got up to the 60s and so forth, he was looked at very favorably. And some historians say you should probably wait 50 years before you judge a president.
Yeah.
And so that you better understand how the cogs in the machine, so to speak, actually turned out in the end, the end product in the end.
You get the full picture.
Yeah, the full picture.
Yeah.
And so I think Carter's reputation was redeemed in many ways. Of course, he pulled off one of the most important world peace treaties, certainly in our lifetime and probably in the latter 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, and that was the Israeli-Egyptian peace accord that still stands, that whatever stability we have there, that is a very important column, I would say, in trying to hold that up. And of course, the whole situation is much more complex, but to keep basically Egypt out of this. And I know other presidents, these and ours, have tried to do similar things with other Arab countries to bring about more stability in that area of the world. Because I used to tell my kids in school that, the Middle East is one of those places that a world war could break out at any moment of any day.
Yeah.
And it is so volatile, and just trying to keep the lid on it is very difficult. So we were getting up to Joe Biden, and Biden is, he, even like President Reagan, appeared to be diminishing in his second term. And this would, of course, be Biden's first term. The debate was a total disaster with Trump in the spring that eventually forced him out. But I think he did a lot of things in the wake of COVID. Many people blame the Inflation Reduction Act for what has caused inflation to go up. Mm-hmm. The inflation is not anywhere near the levels that they were in, say, 1980. I remember that very well, but I understand, and I understand at a time in my life when you're struggling, a young couple with child and so forth, of taking a calculator to the grocery store, people feel that.
Yeah.
And the price of eggs, I'm not a rich man, but I'm not a poor man either, but I don't have to take a calculator to the grocery store. Mm-hmm. And so, but there are people who do. And that, and also a very effective use of what I call cultural politics, and things that scare some people. Men playing on women's, or boys playing on women's sports teams, these mm-hmm. types of things.
Right.
Whether they're real or imagined, that scares some people. And I know that there was McConnell that was talking about this within the month after the election, that said that 30% of the Trump budget went into, in those 7 states that were the swing states, went into commercials of Kamala Harris with this trans man. We've all seen the
yes.
footage and so forth. And she was laughing and so forth, and there are different variations of it, but the gist of it was, she is for them, they, choice of pronouns, right. and Trump is for you. And many people say that those were very effective. And when we're talking about turning a few votes, a few thousand votes here and a few thousand votes there, it can swing an election, because all those states were pretty close. They weren't runaways, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but each one of them theoretically could have flipped the other way with I call it the politics of margins. Mm-hmm. But now Trump, and is not the only person to ever use wedge issues. That's the word we're looking for. Cultural wars, wedge issues. The Democrats use them as well. I'm not trying to say that they're the only folks who did this, and it was used effectively.
Right.
But that scares people about. I know that it was Governor former Governor Terry McAuliffe of, I believe that was his name, in Virginia, back 2 or 4 years ago, running against Youngkin, that he was asked, should parents have a say in their children's education? And he said no. Well, yeah, I'm taught school for 50 years myself, including 17 years in high school too. I disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the parents do have a right to say in their children's education, and those issues I think really hurt the D's, and I don't think most people feel that way, and you start mixing some of the sexual issues in with it and so forth. That scares parents, and I thought that was very effective and used very effectively.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, we got to talk a little bit about Space Command.
Ah, yes. Hey, the Faustian deal with the devil, that's fine. I heard somebody say that.
Do you think...
I want Space Command.
That's right, exactly.
And that's one of the things I really disagree with Biden about. Just purely political, but, that things like that happen. I mean,
right.
How did we get Marshall here in the first place? I will tell you. The primary leader of that was John Sparkman, who was U.S. Senator at the time, and he and Lyndon Johnson were like that. And Houston got part of it, Huntsville got part of it, various other places around the country got part of it. But
any chance of it moving here and just the impact it'll bring to Huntsville?
I certainly hope it is. I mean, it potentially could be a big boom for our area. Of course, if we were to lose other things that we talked about, that would be quite painful.
Right.
Supposedly there are, 1,800 jobs or something with it, high-paying jobs, but that probably doesn't include, I'm guessing here, but I don't think it would include contractors who are brought in to support those missions and so forth. But should have been here in the first place. All the studies that were done said that this was economically and technologically and so forth, probably the best place for it. But it was, they had some cover of some excuse that of readiness or whatever that should stay where it's at. But it was a political decision. Colorado went Democrat, or was going to go Democrat, and that sort of ensured it, I guess. And Alabama was going to go Republican. So
right.
Sometimes politicians punish states. That's a reality.
So the Alabama state legislature, it's back in session next week.
Oh, yes. There's an old adage, and again, I forget exactly who said it, that when the legislature's in session, hold on to your wallet. But
what are some issues you expect to be discussed this year?
Well, of course, one of the things that's happening, now in Alabama we have two funds. We have a general fund, and then we have the education fund. The education fund is about $7 or $8 billion, something like that. The general fund that funds education from kindergarten to universities and even other educational entities, whether reform schools or whatever. They fund all that, and that's very expensive. The general fund budget funds everything else, from the judicial system to roads, and that's very expensive, and the other matters of government. Alabama has been receiving so much money from the COVID, as other states have as well, the COVID funds, but that's going to stop at some point. And what type of a shortfall could that leave us? And so the state, if not this session, the state legislature is going to have to deal with that over the next 3 or 4 sessions as to how to fill that gap. Some have said the way to do it is to legalize gambling, and that's very, very, that is very controversial among some people. Some people are just dead against it in any form. And so they drive to Mississippi and Tennessee and
Georgia. Right. Yeah. Why are so many people opposed to it?
I think many of them are a faith issue opposition, but also the fact is that gambling does, although people gamble illegally all the time anyway, but that it causes poverty and addiction and these types of issues. Even professional sports have just embraced gambling.
Right.
You watch ESPN, you
It's
see it advertised all the
business,
time.
yeah.
Oh yeah, it's a big
yeah.
business. And even if we were to, I guess the most controversial would be casino gambling.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a lottery, of course, although we do have bingo for some instances, and then we got the Porch Creek Indians. And part of the problem with the getting a referendum on the ballot, because since the state constitution says you can't operate gambling facilities, what it would be, it would have to be a referendum that people voted on to have that. Now, we had a vote on the lottery back in 2001, and it was defeated. Many critics have pointed out that there was a lot of religious opposition to it and so forth, and critics have pointed out that it was the casinos in Mississippi that actually funded the churches to actually campaign against it. But if we were to have it, I would hope that it would run better than the Marijuana Commission. They can't get their act together. I mean,
Right.
God Almighty, it's to even open up any medicinal marijuana dispensaries.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just tied up in court as to who's going to get the licenses. And I also like to point this out about the marijuana thing. I've got to throw this in. Many of the very people who would have put you under the jail a decade ago or so are the people who were involved in dispensing this and owning it.
You haven't any examples?
I'm not going to call it.
Okay. Yes, sir. Well, Dr. Burke, thank you so much for coming in today and chatting it up about politics.
Anytime.
I greatly appreciate
AJ.
it.
Good deal.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Good deal, sir.